15-year-old Klaus Becker was crouched behind a pile of rubble, holding a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon that felt too heavy for his thin frame. He was exhausted, hungry, and terrified. He hadn't eaten properly in 3 days. The uniform he'd received just 2 weeks earlier now hung loosely on him, and the Volkssturm armband on his arm felt more like a burden than anything else. Through the dust and smoke, he could hear them, American tanks rolling forward, soldiers shouting in English, sweeping through the city 1 block at a time. His group, if you could call 12 scared teenagers and 3 elderly men a group, had been pushed back until there was nowhere else to go. In his head, he kept hearing what he'd been told over and over again in Hitler Youth. The Americans were monsters. They would kill prisoners without mercy. Better to die for the Fuhrer than fall into enemy hands. Their unit leader, an SS officer who had vanished the day before, had warned them, if you're captured, they'll torture you, then kill you. Fight to the end, or use your last bullet on yourself. Klaus had believed every word. Why wouldn't he? That's all he had ever heard. Americans, he was taught, weren't even human. If he gave up, he would suffer before being killed. To him, there were only 2 choices, fight or die. The tank was getting closer. Klaus raised a Panzerfaust, trying to remember the short training session he'd had. Aim, fire, done. But his friend Friedrich, just 14, had tried the same thing the day before. The weapon's backblast knocked him out cold, and he was gunned down before he could even move. Now, Klaus's finger was on the trigger. The tank was about 30 meters away. Maybe he could hit it. Maybe not. But if he didn't try, wasn't he a coward? Wasn't he betraying Germany? The tank stopped. Its turret turned, pointing right at him. Klaus shut his eyes, bracing for the explosion that would end his life. But instead of a shot, he heard a voice loud in rough German. Come out, boy. Put your weapon down. Klaus froze. They called him boy, not enemy. The voice repeated, firm but not harsh. We won't shoot. Come out. He didn't move. He was sure it was a trick. Show yourself, and they'll gun you down. That's what he'd been taught. But then again, hadn't the same people told him that Germany was winning? That secret weapons would turn the war around? He'd seen Berlin fall apart. The lies were piling up. What if this was another lie, this time from the Nazis? His hands shaking, Klaus lowered a Panzerfaust and slowly stood up, raising his arms. His voice cracked as he called out, don't shoot. 3 American soldiers appeared. They had their rifles up, but they weren't firing. They looked huge in their gear. Klaus had been told Americans were weak, but these men were anything but. One of them was black. Klaus had been told black American soldiers were the most dangerous of all. He squeezed his eyes shut again, waiting for pain. Instead, a hand gently touched his shoulder. Klaus flinched, expecting violence, but the grip steadied him. He opened his eyes to see the black soldier offering him canteen. Trinken, the man said. Drink. Klaus stared, confused. This was the enemy? The man wasn't angry. He looked concerned. Klaus took the canteen with shaking hands. The water was clean, cold, and better than anything he'd tasted in weeks. When he handed it back, the soldier nodded and motioned for him to join other prisoners nearby. No beatings, no torture, just water, a nod, a quiet instruction to sit with others who were also unhurt, some even eating American rations. As Klaus walked toward them in shock, everything he thought he knew was crumbling. The monsters had shown him kindness. The so-called barbarians had spared him. It was all lies. The Volkssturm, or People's Storm, had been Nazi Germany's last-ditch effort to stop defeat. Starting in late September 1944, the government forced all males between 16 and 60 into service, though in reality, even boys as young as 12 were drafted. Some joined because they believed the propaganda. Others were taken from school or home and thrown into battle with barely any training. About 6 million were conscripted, with 1.5 million actually sent into combat. An estimated 100,000 teenage boys, aged 12 to 17, saw action. It's believed that 40,000 to 60,000 of them were killed. Training often lasted just days. They were given old rifles, captured gear, and homemade explosives. These kids had grown up in the Hitler Youth. They were taught that death for Führer was noble, that retreat was cowardly, and that surrender was shameful. Propaganda told them that the Allies were monsters. Films, books, even school lessons painted the enemy as cruel, brutal killers. To them, capture meant torture, or worse. Klaus Becker was one of them. He'd joined Hitler Youth at 10. For 5 years, he'd done drills and soaked in the ideology. So when the Volkssturm drafted him in April 1945, he was scared, but also proud. He thought he was doing something honorable by fighting for Germany. That illusion collapsed fast. His squad received just 3 days of training. How to fire a rifle, how to aim a Panzerfaust. Then they were sent to defend Kreuzberg with a handful of weapons. Klaus later recalled, "We were 12 boys and 3 old men. The oldest boy was 17. The youngest was 13. We had 8 rifles for Panzerfaust and maybe 50 bullets. Our officer told us we'd be shot if we ran. Then he vanished on the first day. They were terrified, starving, and waiting to die. The propaganda that had shaped them was deadly. For years, Nazi messaging had convinced German children that surrender was worse than death. Textbooks described Allied atrocities. Radio programs told of mass killings. Movies showed American and British troops as sadists. Hitler Youth meetings repeated these messages constantly. To young minds raised to think they were racially superior, the idea that enemies were savage made perfect sense. Many carried poison or saved one bullet just in case they were captured. Some fought until they passed out, thinking anything was better than falling into Allied hands. 16-year-old Hermann Schultz, captured near Würzburg, remembered, "I was told Americans skinned prisoners alive, that they took body parts as trophies. When they surrounded us, I put my rifle in my mouth to shoot myself. An American soldier knocked it away. I begged him to shoot me quickly. He just looked shocked. He said something I didn't understand at the time. Later I learned it was, 'Jesus Christ, he's just a kid.' This mindset made child soldiers extremely dangerous. They fought with nothing to lose. American troops moving through Germany were stunned to face teenagers ready to die rather than surrender. 'I shot him. It was justified,' said a U.S. soldier looking back. He was armed, hostile, dangerous, but still just a kid. I see his face when I close my eyes. I'm glad I made it home, but his death still haunts me." Klaus Becker's change. For Klaus and thousands of other German teenage fighters, surrender didn't just end the fighting. It shook them to their core. Hours after being captured, Klaus sat among 14 other young Volkssturm prisoners, aged 13 to 17. American troops had given them water, food, blankets, and even medical care. The guards kept an eye on them, but didn't treat them harshly. The cruelty they had feared never came. What Klaus saw instead were American soldiers doing their jobs, calm, organized, focused on their tasks. These boys weren't treated as threats or enemies. They were just more prisoners to process. And that normalcy hit hard. Klaus had braced himself to die for Germany. He thought capture meant torture. But here he was, sitting on rubble, eating crackers, while American troops barely paid attention to him. "I kept waiting for the torture," Klaus remembered. "But it never came. The guards looked bored, not angry. One was eating chocolate, another reading a letter. They didn't even look at us like we mattered." The black American soldier, who had first given Klaus water, returned with more rations. Klaus flinched, still expecting violence. The soldier paused, saw Klaus's fear, and gently said in German, "No one's going to hurt you." This moment stayed with Klaus for the rest of his life. A man he'd been told was dangerous, someone he was supposed to hate, was trying to make sure he felt safe. "That's when everything fell apart," Klaus later said. "The lies about Americans, about race, about who was right, all of it crumbled. That man showed me more humanity than my own government ever had." The camps, when German child soldiers were taken to POW camps, they discovered that American captivity meant survival, not punishment. These camps held a mix of soldiers, regular Army, SS, and Volkssturm members of all ages. The younger prisoners quickly stood out. They were often given extra food and sometimes kept separate from adults to protect them from further influence by hardcore Nazis. Some camps even organized basic classes or activities. Chaplains paid close attention to these boys, worried about their mental state and future. Klaus spent 7 months in a camp near Mannheim. His experience there shattered what he thought he knew. We ate regularly, better than I had in months. We had shelter, medical care, even some books. One guard, who had sons my age, taught me English. He treated me like a person, not like a prisoner. These camps, without intending to, became places where many of these teenagers were deprogrammed. They weren't given lectures or punished. They just experienced fair treatment and saw the truth for themselves. The enemy wasn't what they had been taught. One teen, Hermann Schultz, put it this way: I had time to think. I talked with other prisoners. Some admitted the war had been wrong. I saw how the Americans treated us with decency. It made me realize I'd been fighting for something evil. That truth was painful, but I needed to face it. Coming home, when these teenage prisoners were eventually sent home, many brought back stories that shocked their families. Klaus returned to Berlin in late 1945. The city was destroyed. His home was gone. His father had died on the Eastern Front. His mother was living in a basement. But Klaus was healthy, wearing American-issue clothes, and carrying a letter from the American guard who had taught him English. His mother had assumed he was dead. I thought I lost you, she told him through tears. I was sure the Americans would kill you. That's what we were told. Instead, he'd survived. He'd been fed, cared for, and treated with unexpected kindness. Klaus's story was not unusual. Across Germany, families were reunited with children they never thought they'd see again, often in better shape than when they were taken. These homecomings helped reshape how many Germans saw America. The fear and hate built up by Nazi propaganda clashed with the reality their sons had lived through. Many former child soldiers later became advocates for democracy and peace. They knew, firsthand, how dangerous lies could be. They knew what war had stolen from them and what mercy had given back. Peter Hoffman, another teenage fighter, wrote years later, I owe my life to Americans who had every reason to let me die. I tried to kill them. They saved me anyway. That act of mercy changed me forever. By the numbers, from March to May 1945, it's estimated that 40,000 to 60,000 German child soldiers fought American troops. Around 15,000 to 20,000 were killed. 12,000 to 15,000 were wounded. 18,000 to 25,000 were captured. And about 95% of them survived. Their survival rate was much higher than that of adult prisoners. The Americans prioritized treating children humanely. Roughly 40,000 child soldiers received medical attention. About 900 surgeries were performed. Around 130 prosthetics were provided, and post-war care was arranged in nearly 2,800 cases. About 20,000 children passed through American POW camps. Most stayed 6 to 9 months and received basic education or training before release. Fewer than 500 died in U.S. custody. These numbers tell a clear story. When American troops encountered armed German children, they fought if necessary, but captured when possible, treated the wounded, and released them safely. That was a stark contrast to how Nazi Germany treated its own youth, using them as expendable tools in a losing war. The emotional toll. For American soldiers, the memories of fighting children never faded. Many struggle with guilt, nightmares, and lasting confusion. Even those who did what was necessary, shooting to protect themselves or their units, carried emotional scars. Sergeant Robert Mitchell remembered killing 2 teenage fighters near Nuremberg. I did what I had to do. They were shooting at us, but they were still kids. I wonder every day who they might have become if Hitler hadn't sent them to die. Others, like Private Eugene Henderson, made every effort to avoid firing on kids. I'm glad I didn't kill any of them. But I also feel guilty. Some American soldiers died because someone hesitated. War forces impossible choices. I did what I could live with, but it still weighs on me. These experiences shaped post-war American policy. U.S. forces occupying Germany banned all military training for youth, disbanded Hitler Youth, and worked to build a democratic system that protected children. Many who had faced child soldiers in battle were determined to never see it happen again. They weren't to blame, said Captain William Hayes. Their government betrayed them. Our job after the war was to make sure Germany never used children like that again. The last seen Berlin, May 1945. At a temporary POW processing center in Berlin, Klaus Becker sat with other captured boys, all between 13 and 17 years old. They had been taken prisoner over the past week. They had been fed, checked by medics, and were now waiting to be moved to permanent camps. The same black American soldier who had offered Klaus water on the day of his capture returned, this time carrying a crate. Inside were chocolate bars, one for each boy. "For you, good children," the soldier said in careful German. Klaus stared at the chocolate. He hadn't tasted any since he was 9 years old, before the war, before everything changed. The soldier saw the look on his face and gently said, "War is over." Then in English, "You get to be kids again." Klaus looked around. Some of the boys were crying. Others just sat there, staring at their chocolate, unsure what to do. A few started eating. Klaus took a bite. The sweetness hit him hard, not just a taste, but what it meant. The Americans had beaten them. They had every reason to hate them. Instead, they gave them chocolate. Instead of punishment, kindness. Instead of death, life. Instead of hatred, mercy. Klaus started crying, not from fear, but because everything he believed had been a lie. The Americans weren't the enemy. He had nearly died fighting for something evil, and the people who had defeated it were showing him more compassion than his own leaders ever had. The soldier noticed and asked gently, "Alles gut?" Klaus nodded, too emotional to speak. He held up the chocolate bar with shaking hands, a silent thank you. The soldier nodded back and moved on, handing out more chocolate to more boys who'd been sent to die for a regime that had lied to them. In that moment, with tears running down his face and candy melting his mouth, Klaus Becker learned what mercy really meant. It meant being treated like a child again, even after trying to be a soldier. It meant being forgiven. The war was over, and for the first time in years, Klaus Becker had a future. Thanks to the kindness of those he'd once called enemies,